Tonight, we're not just telling a story, we're opening a file. It's a cold case, more than 3,000 years old, one that stumped historians, archaeologists, and theologians for centuries. We're talking about a case with millions of alleged witnesses, a crime scene the size of a desert, and a prime suspect that's an entire empire. The file is open. The investigation begins now. And this is the promise at the very heart of our investigation. A divine guarantee of liberation on a scale you can barely imagine. A whole nation of slaves would just walk free, while the most powerful empire on earth is brought to its knees. I mean, it's the stuff of legends, right? And right there, that's the twist. That's the central, haunting question that turns this epic into an enduring mystery. What do you do when one of the grandest claims in all of history meets a wall of complete, and I mean utter, silence? Okay, so before we can examine the evidence, or the lack of it, we have to understand the story itself. We have to look at the narrative that has literally shaped civilizations and inspired freedom movements for thousands of years. This is the official account in all its cinematic glory. So our story starts in the heart of ancient Egypt. Here, the descendants of Jacob, the Israelites, have become a nation of slaves. The book of Exodus tells us their lives were made bitter with harsh labor, building massive cities for a Pharaoh who was terrified of their growing numbers.
Into this world of oppression steps our protagonist, Moses, a Hebrew by birth but raised, incredibly, as a prince of Egypt. He's a man caught between two worlds. He flees into exile, only to be stopped in his tracks by a divine voice, speaking from a bush that burns but is never consumed. And his mission? Go back to Egypt and demand freedom for his people. When Pharaoh refuses, the story unleashes a series of, supernatural attacks. The 10 plagues aren't just disasters, they're a systematic takedown of Egypt's gods and the empire's power. The Nile River turns to blood, the sky rains down fire, and a terrifying darkness blankets the land. It all builds to the 10th, most horrific plague, the death of every firstborn son in Egypt. Broken by that final plague, Pharaoh finally lets the Israelites go, but almost immediately he changes his mind. He pursues them with his entire army of chariots, trapping them at the edge of the sea. And this is where the story hits its absolute climax. Moses raises his staff, the waters part, and the Israelites cross on dry ground. And just as the Egyptian army follows, the walls of water come crashing down, wiping them out completely. The ultimate miracle, the final escape.
What a story. Absolutely incredible. But the story is just the starting point. Now we have to do the real work. We hunt for proof, for corroborating evidence. And in a case this massive, the first clue we find is a profound, truly deafening silence from the historical record. I mean, the gap here is just staggering. The Bible describes a mobile city of maybe 2 million people. Can you just imagine the footprint of that many people wandering the Sinai Desert for 40 years? They would have left behind something. Pottery, tools, campsites, graves, anything. And yet decades of intense archaeological digs have found nothing. And what about the Egyptians? Their records were famously detailed, but they have no mention of a catastrophic slave revolt, no mention of devastating plagues, and certainly no mention of losing their entire army in the sea. So after all that searching, the number of artifacts confirming this huge migration is precisely what you see right there: 0. And in an investigation this old, a complete lack of physical evidence is the evidence. It's telling us something. And this forces us to ask a totally different kind of question. If the case for a literal historical exodus is so incredibly thin, why on earth is this one of the most powerful and enduring stories in all of human history? Are we looking for the wrong kind of evidence? Maybe the real truth of the Exodus isn't buried in the sand at all. When the physical evidence runs cold, any good investigator goes back and re-examines the documents. You look at alternative theories. So let's look closer at the story itself and the scientific and scholarly attempts to decode it. Well, one fascinating theory suggests the 10 plagues weren't 10 separate miracles, but a single catastrophic chain reaction of natural events. So think about it. A massive volcanic eruption like the one on the island of Pharaoh could have pumped ash into the sky, causing darkness. That same event could have triggered a toxic algae bloom, turning the Nile red,
killing the fish, driving frogs ashore, which then leads to insect swarms and disease. Now, it doesn't prove the story, but it gives us a fascinating glimpse of how a memory of a real ecological disaster could have been woven into this epic narrative.
So next, we have to examine our star witness, the text itself. For centuries, everyone just assumed Moses was the author, but modern scholarship suggests something far more complex. The documentary hypothesis argues that the text is really a patchwork woven together over hundreds of years from different oral traditions and written sources, and each of those sources had its own agenda. So what does that mean for us? It means we're not reading a single eyewitness account, but a national epic that was edited and compiled long after the supposed events.
This compilation theory makes stating the event itself pretty much impossible. Scholars can't even agree on the century. Some point to the 15th century BCE, others to the 13th century under Ramesses the Great. But there's a really compelling third theory that suggests the story as we know it wasn't even written down until the 6th century BCE, while the Israelites were in exile in Babylon. Now, if that's true, it changes everything. It's not a historical report, it's a story of hope, a powerful piece of writing for a displaced people, reminding them that God had saved them from a great empire once before and could do it again. This lack of a clear timeline, or a single author, it forces a radical shift in our investigation. It makes you wonder, what if we've been asking the wrong questions all along? What if the story's true power isn't in its historical accuracy, but in its meaning? The real genius of the story might be that it's working on all these different levels at the same time. I mean, maybe there's a tiny kernel of historical memory, a small group of people who did escape Egypt, and their story just got bigger and bigger over generations. On another level, it's a spiritual allegory of salvation, and it's definitely a political manifesto, a founding myth for a nation. But maybe most powerfully, it's a psychological blueprint for every single person's journey from being trapped to being free. And this is where the story's power becomes real, something you can touch, written not in stone, but in human history. We hear it in the spirituals sung by enslaved African Americans who saw their own fight in the Israelites' cry for freedom. They didn't need archaeological proof to know the story was true for them. It became a living, breathing promise that liberation was possible, that tyrants always fall, and that a higher justice will prevail. Its impact on history is a fact, even if the event itself remains a mystery. So, after looking at the narrative, the silent stones, and all these layers of meaning, what's the verdict in this 3,000-year-old cold case? Well, the conclusion might be that the Exodus is something more complex than simple history. It's a foundational myth. And that word myth doesn't mean false. It means a story that gives a culture its deepest sense of meaning, identity, and purpose. And for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this story of a God who sides with the oppressed and leads them to freedom is the very bedrock of their worldview. And that's really the final question this case leaves us with. For thousands of years, people have been searching for Pharaoh's chariots at the bottom of the sea. But maybe we've been looking in the wrong place all along. Maybe the real power isn't in proving what happened back then, but in what the story continues to do right now, inspiring all of us to believe that no oppression is permanent, and that a path to freedom can open up right where there seems to be no way out. The case, it would seem, remains open. And maybe that's the whole point.